So today, my guest is Billy Barwald, and Billy Barwald is the owner, proprietor of the Flying Dragon Citrus Nursery, and he also has a lot of other Jacksonville history to tell us today, in addition to his citrus nursery. So I'd first like to welcome you, Mr. Barwald, Billy, you've instructed me to call you, Billy, to the show today. Welcome. Thank you for being here.
Not at all. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure.
Well, thank you. And I said you're not only going to talk about your wonderful citrus nursery that you've created here, you actually are a long-time landscape architect in the city and sort of have retired to the citrus nursery. But I'd actually like to start the program sort of at your very beginning, because you have, and then we're going to go back to the citrus nursery right away. But you have a very interesting beginning with Jacksonville, Florida. I had asked you, were you a native? Because I just assumed you were an 87-year native of Jacksonville. And because you're 87 years old,
yes.
And you are indeed an 87-year native, but you told me you weren't born here. Would you tell, please, Billy, the story of your birth, and that will reveal sort of who you are in the city's history?
Well, while I wasn't born here, I came when I was, what, 4 months old. My mother was pregnant. My grandfather had rented a house up in Deal, New Jersey, because he was working in New York at the time. And the flu epidemic was raging in Jacksonville. It was the Spanish flu was very, very, bad here in Jacksonville. And my grandfather insisted that she come up and get out of the danger of the flu. And so she came to Deal, and I was born to be with my mother, so I was born there. And I was there till September, and then my father came up and got us both, and we came back, and I've been in Jacksonville ever since.
So since you were a few months old and left here, and were born elsewhere because your grandfather insisted. Now the other piece of the story is the man who was your grandfather, and that man happened to be Morris Cohen, one of the two brothers who ran the venerable Cohen Brothers department store in Jacksonville, Florida. And while the wonderful Cohen Brothers, so many of us relate to the huge giant building that was down on Hemming Park, which is today our City Hall, that same identical building. That's what we think of. Cohen Brothers had a history much longer and stronger with Jacksonville, Florida, that opened long before that 1912 building was constructed. So your family has such a long history in the city, right back to the days of the Civil War, if not earlier, I would suspect.
Well, they actually, I think, started in the 1870s, right after the Civil War. And the store was down on Bay Street, and it flourished there as a small department store until the fire in 1901. And then the store was burned to the ground, as most of Jacksonville was, as you know. And they rebuilt on that site for a while, but they wanted a bigger store. And the St. James Hotel had been on the site where the St. James building is now, and it had burned down. And it was a city block, much bigger building, and so they went and borrowed the money to buy the block and build a much, much bigger store. And moved there, I think, in 1912, actually.
1912, the same year the Titanic sank, that magnificent department store opened. And I promised to get to the citrus, but we'll keep talking about the store for a few minutes. And when that store opened, newspapers of the day reported that Cohen Brothers department store, the new one, the 1912 one, the one where our City Hall is today, rivaled any emporium in Europe, the finest emporium in Europe, and went on to talk about it. It certainly rivaled as well any major department store in Boston or New York. And indeed, when that store opened, it was one of the largest department stores in the United States. In this town of, at the time, let's see, Jacksonville had about 60,000 people. So that was monumental.
Well, it was the most important store in town, obviously. And it was well known and well, you know, furbished and operated for many years as a big department store, the biggest one certainly in the South during that period.
And Mr. Barwald, right now, Billy, I'm sorry, you see on the monitor, we have this great photograph of all these people gathered around the store window. And you might want to reflect for a minute on the Cohen brothers' windows.
Well, of course, they had a window decorator, which was a man himself who did nothing but, quote, decorate the windows. And it was quite an important job because that was their main advertising for the business. And the man did a wonderful job, and I can't recall his name right off the top of my head, but I knew who he was. And people used to come and look in the windows and window shop, I guess was the term, and was very successful as far as the store was concerned in getting people to come in and buy.
Now, you mentioned to me, as you look at the monitor again, here's a little cigar and candy store of sorts encompassed within Cohen Brothers Department Store, and you talked about that earlier and why the store was set up that way.
Well, as I understand it, and I think I'm pretty accurate, in the beginning they couldn't afford to actually stock this enormous building, which was a huge building. So some of the departments in the store in the beginning were actually leased out to private enterprise. I think the women's hairdresser department, the restaurant, the candy department, and probably the tobacco department. Mm-hmm. And it could have been some of the others too, I'm not too sure, but I know many of the smaller parts of this department store were not actually owned and operated by the Cohen brothers.
I know in some of our 1912 exterior photos of Cohen brothers, and I don't think we have any of these with us today, there was actually both a Liggett's and a Rexall Drugs. Both drugstores were encompassed within the Cohen brothers department store originally. Now there's the front facade in that wonderful ornamental and protective overhang at the front door. Anything you want to say about that in particular?
Well, the whole store was quite a very, very important structure in itself, in the way it was built, in the way it was designed, and it was imposing by any standards that you wanted to give it. And Mr. Clutho was the architect, as you probably know.
Henry Clutho.
And a very important man in Jacksonville architecture. And the store was built according to Bob Broward, who is pretty much local architect, who's much of authority on the structure itself. Was actually, the whole thing was built in 18 months, which is kind of a remarkable thing considering in those days that horse-drawn carriages were quite prominent. But the whole thing was built very quickly and very rapidly and very successfully.
Yeah, I think I've read somewhere that in 1912, when that building opened, they built it, it's supposed to cost $1 million. Henry Clutho, the architect, brought it in for $500,000 because he also served as the contractor. Workers, ordinary workers on it, got paid $2 a day, which was probably a pretty good wage.
Oh yeah, I'm sure.
And so just such an exciting building. It's Prairie School in Design shocked the city of Jacksonville when it opened, both in its size, well, as it was being built, because of its size, so enormous, and the modernness of it. It was Prairie School style architecture, and of course Jacksonville, Florida, ended up having more Prairie School style architecture than any city outside of the Midwest, and this is our grand dame of Prairie School architecture, no doubt about it. And you were kind enough to mention Bob Broward, who is the authority on
well, he probably taught me more about the store than my family did, really, because we didn't really talk about it too much, but Bob researched it and did a wonderful job in his book about it, and if you read the book and talk to him about it, you can really learn a lot about it.
And now that you are mentioning his book, I happen to grab it from the floor. I have it right here. His book, Bob Broward's book, the architecture of Henry John Clouthier. And this one, you see that the front of the book features what so many consider Mr. Clouthier's masterpiece, your grandfather's Cohen Brothers department store. And it's just a beautiful book, and I am proud to say published by the Jacksonville Historical Society, authored by Bob Broward. And so I hope people give us a call if they'd like to get a copy of that book, or a lot of local bookstores carry it.
Well, I don't know really how much input my grandfather had in, quote, the design of the store. I have always understood that they gave Mr. Clouthier pretty much a free hand to design and build like he wanted to, and they apparently had a lot of confidence in him and his ability and his design. And so I don't think either one of the brothers, either Morris, who was my grandfather, or Jacob, actually interfered very much with Mr. Clouthier's operation, I'll put it that way.
Well, that is very much how I've read the history, too, that they did have a great deal of confidence in Henry Clouthier. On the other hand, you remember, and I hope the camera can pick this picture up, and I'm not certain that it can. I have this very interesting, not as clear as I would like, photograph of the interior of the building. Let me turn it there. I'm going to try to get the glare off. The interior prior to 1912 to 1927. And what you can't see is the big glass dome perched above this area. This is all the center. Of course, the glass dome is back today, albeit much higher, because originally it was just above the mezzanine. Few people know that. But in 1927, the glass dome or skylight, gigantic in size, was removed from the building over Mr. Clouthier's objections. Of course, this is 15 years after his original design. And your grandfather, Morris, and your uncle, Jacob, did I get that right, Jacob? Yes, I did. Yeah. They then would expand the store. They would floor over at that level, and they would expand the store tremendously by getting rid of this skylight. Let me ask you this, because I've met so few people who do. Do you remember that original skylight?
Oh, sure.
You do?
Sure.
See, you're one of the few people.
See, my grandfather used to go to the store every day. He was a merchant. That's what, the store was his life, basically. And as far as I can remember, he spent 7 days a week in that store. Every Sunday morning, we lived in Riverside, and every Sunday morning he used to get on the streetcar and go down to the store and walk through the store and make notes or whatever. And as a little kid, I remember occasionally my mother would send my cousin and I along with him, because he'd get in the store and forget the time. And in those days, they had the big dinner in the middle of the day on Sundays, and he would be late coming home for dinner. So my mother used to tell us, my cousin and I, be sure to get Grandpa and bring him home for dinner. And dinner, not lunch, but dinner. And so we would play in the toy department, and when 12 o'clock came, we'd run through the store, Grandpa, Grandpa, come on, we got to get home, and round him up and drag him home.
Well, this had to be every little boy's dream, because the toy department was magnificent.
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, it was, I mean, when you're 6 or 8 or 10 years old, you could play in the toy department forever in Cohen Brothers.
So, I mean, so you were ideally the inspiration for one of these movies they make today about a child getting locked in a toy store or what have you.
It was exciting and fun and a great experience, really.